Para Branford Marsalis, muchos de los estudiantes de jazz tienen una gran técnica, pero no han encontrado su propia sonoridad, ya que desconocen el trabajo de sus antecesores.
There's a very popular idea in popular music now is that the way for the music to move forward is by pretending that everything that came before it doesn't exist. And people are doing that in jazz too. So they listen to John Coltrane, of course, but everything before John Coltrane, they don't listen to that. So the music has a one-dimensional sound rather than a multi-dimensional sound. But if young jazz students would accept the fact that the music in the 1920s and the 1930s and the early 1940s is just as good as the music in the late 50s and the late 60s, then they would definitely have a very different sound. But they tend to all use the same material. That's why it all sounds the same.
Hijo del pianista Ellis Marsalis y la cantante Dolores Ferdinand, Branford Marsalis es el mayor de 5 hermanos, 3 de los cuales son referentes en el mundo de la música: Winton, DeFollo y Jason. Este jazzista y tenor ha sabido utilizar para su carrera lo mejor de la música popular, la clásica y el jazz.
Well, with Phil Collins, it was just one concert. It was that Live Aid concert in 1985. So I didn't really work with Phil Collins. I played one song with Phil Collins, but I did work with Sting for 4 years. And I learned a lot. I learned a lot about how to use a saxophone to work with a singer. Because a lot of times when we play, we just play all the time. Saxophone players, we're always playing. And I really learned how to play in the places where he was not singing. And then when I would play in the places where he was singing, I would play fewer notes so that it worked well. It was a very educational experience for me. I learned a lot about songwriting. I learned a lot about a lot of different things. Well, the classical music is just it's unbelievably difficult to play, and that's why I like it, because I have to practice a lot. With jazz, it's hard in the early years because you're trying to develop a vocabulary, and once you develop your vocabulary, then you can pretty much play how you're thinking or feeling at the time. Whereas in classical music, you can't change those notes. The notes are there, and you have to play all of those notes, and you have to play them correctly, and then you have to find a way to make it musical. So it's always a challenge.
Para los conciertos que ofreció en la Ciudad de México, Branford Marsalis optó por interpretar las piezas que integran su más reciente producción titulada 4MF's Playing Tunes.
The reason, the title, it was a joke. It wasn't supposed to be the title, but the people in my company loved it, and they did that. I had nothing to do with that. But so many times when you make a jazz record, because people aren't used to jazz and they don't know, they imagine it as being some really intense, complicated music, and it's really not once you understand it. So I was doing an interview, and the guy kept asking me what the concept of the record was. And I said, well, we don't really have a concept. All we're trying to do is play every song on the record. We're trying to figure out what sounds we can create to make that song sound the best that it can sound. So the guy said, well, if you had to name it a concept, what would you name it? And I said, oh, okay, 4 motherfuckers playing tunes. And the people from my company laughed when they heard it. And they said, that's a great title for a record. And I went, yeah, sure, yeah. And a few months later, the record's being put together, and that's on the cover. And I went, you can't use that. And they said, no, it's very funny. We're going to use it. So I lost that battle. And a lot of people think that I named the record. I didn't really name this record, but...
Noticias 22, Alberto Aranda.